And a round of applause, please.
Please don't clap. Can you hear me okay? And you can see a slide, yeah? Okay, we're business. I'm so bummed that I can't be there in the room with you, and I'm also very excited not to give you the like lung crap that I have right now. So I had to call Ted like 2 days ago and say, you don't want me in your space. Please bear with me. I had to take a lot of Benadryl last night. Drank a lot of coffee this morning. It's not a perfectly ideal situation for like the flame of cognition, but we're gonna give it our best shot. I should just give you like, I mean, that was a great intro. Thank you. Ooh, there we go. I want to say thank you to Ted and to Boris and to everybody who's been like making this all work. The streaming experience has actually been really good, and it's been fun to see like the experiments with streaming that are going on, and also having a YouTube channel for when that doesn't work as well. And also thank you to the Blue Sky folks who have been army crawling along on this work for like the 2-year decade that you've just been through. Thank you especially to Ted, who's been like making sure that I could actually make it to the screen this morning. I want to just situate, like, thank you for the great intro. I am a writer and researcher working on the internet, like both as in trying to make the internet itself better, in early advocacy for accessibility in the open web and better networks, but also trying to do useful things on the internet, like building more humane forms of journalism and doing that pandemic work. But I'm here specifically, and I think the reason Boris and Ted asked me here is that right now I'm really trying to come in as someone who's done both of those things and try to produce knowledge and thinking that's useful to people who are working on at Proto, but also like across all of the decentralized and new network experiments and projects that are happening right now, which is a roundabout way of saying that I also work on Fediverse stuff. But I've come around. I was a little bit of a skeptic on the App Proto stuff, but it's been an amazing couple of years watching this come together as an open ecosystem. And it was a great day of talks yesterday that I watched. So I'm going to jump in. Last summer, I gave a talk at the XOXO Festival in Portland about my own experience kind of giving up on the social internet because of its predatory structures and incentives, down with all of this sort of thing. And then really getting pulled back into that world by my pandemic work and being kind of convicted that we actually do have to make the big world networking work and work much better to accomplish some very baseline goals like collective survival. And I ended that talk with a call to dig into the social and technical aspects of making networks that are safer and more habitable and better at helping us find the people we need to be working with. And, that went over reasonably well. It was like an internet nerd festival, but people had questions, which was like, how? I have thoughts about this that I've been dragging around for years. And I imagine that my next talk, I'd really get to be way nerdier and get into these questions of like how our work is like forestry and the problem with Heidegger's standing reserve and what we can learn from the magnificent sustainability of coppicing and pollarding practices. And I had my next painting picked out that I was gonna, build the talk around, which is Bruegel's Gloomy Day. This is the second Bruegel you're getting in 2 days. Thank you, Blaine. Look at this. This is great. I had a whole thing planned out. We were going to talk about what it means to do this traditional forestry practice. But then, the election happened and the rapid descent into authoritarian rule and dismantling of the administrative state. So here we are. And I want to push aside some of those more abstract things and get down to some absolute basics that are things I think we are all going to need very much right now. At the same time, I'm extremely resistant as a person to like offering prescriptions. Like I came up in the early world of user experience and I really don't believe in taking advice from random talkers when you could be communicating with the people whose needs you're trying to meet. But there are a few things that have come up over and over again across all the work I've been doing, and things that I think are especially essential right now, and that even though they're not maybe fully cooked, I wanted to bring to you so that we can think about them together in a community of practice. So they're coming out of a particular perspective. So I want to just briefly mention the three projects that I've worked on that have most shaped my thinking on this. One is the COVID tracking project that Ted mentioned, and yeah, I get into that in the XOXO talks online. There's a bunch of stuff that you can find if you want, but I'll just say, like, my experiences there with a project that was so much on and of the network that could never have happened without a mass outpouring of time and attention and love from hundreds of total strangers online, really did change the way I think about the necessity of big world networking specifically. That work also put me into direct contact and conflict with organized, sophisticated, hybrid online, offline campaigns designed to lie to people about reality, which changed some things in my brain. Another one, some in-depth ethnographic work I did last year with Darius Kazemi, who is maybe in the room now, interviewing a bunch of really delightful people about the material realities of running Fediverse servers. And also my work on what turned out to be like a 40,000 word incident report synthesizing accounts of the role that Facebook and Meta played in a genocide in Myanmar in 2017 of the Rohingya people. And that was a thing I had read about and kind of seen go by as an interested observer, but didn't think I completely understood, and which turned out to be honestly something much more terrifying than I had imagined. Really, an example of a kind of carelessness and callousness and refusal to hear increasingly desperate warnings from civil society. And I want to note, like, I work on this stuff that is occasionally extremely gruesome, not because I really want to tell everyone how awful the social internet is, although some of it is bad, but because I love us and I don't want us to fall into the same pit traps and potholes from our past. Like, I wanted us to fall in new potholes and make new and different mistakes. So those are the things that are kind of running alongside my overall like couple decades of experience as like a terminally architecture brain person watching network dynamics across communities and networks since Twitter was a tiny baby and Blaine was doing the things he talked about yesterday. So those are my priors, maybe less in like the philosophical sense and more as a series of crimes. But I want to get into two things specifically that I think may be useful to think about together. And so this is going to be two short talks about two different things. And the first one is vulnerable people. I feel like the idea of listening to vulnerable people is something that's been coming up for so long and frankly to so little effect that it kind of triggers reflexive eye rolls. Like the most superficial and self-serving kind of corporate social responsibility stuff. I have rarely seen it operationalized in meaningful or sustained ways on social internet projects, except for when those projects actually emerge from communities that are typically harassed and targeted. But I'm an optimist. I still think this is actually a centrally important thing. And I think it's not being operationalized because it's not especially legible as a practice that especially small technology teams and projects can actually do. Which I think is especially important for an ecosystem like the one that AtProto is enabling, because it's not going to be one monolithic company working on this stuff and figuring it all out. It's a bunch of people working at very different levels who could really use some common knowledge to build from, and that's something that comes up a lot in conversations with people that I'm working with who are doing stuff in these ecosystems. So I want to say I don't mean like social listening, like following the discourse for reactions. That's fine and valuable sometimes, but I want to talk about actively seeking out like the intelligent and informed perspectives of the most vulnerable people in groups that you're building for before and during rollouts and changes, and in some fairly specific ways. But like rewind why the most vulnerable people, this one's easy. It's because if you can keep the most vulnerable people safe, you can keep everyone safe. But if you just make a bunch of rigid decisions based on vibes and without like real ongoing consultation with heavily targeted communities, you can't really do this. And also, if you only respond to the loudest voices, you're going to miss a lot. So one way I think that it's useful to think about this is the idea of social threat modeling. And this is not new. I think there's at least one person at the conference, John Pincus, who's been writing about this since 2017, 2018, working on this with, I think, predominantly Black women on Twitter. It's not a new idea, but I want to talk specifically about, a potential practice of collaborative social threat modeling. And this is drawing heavily on a lot of the work that the EFF has been doing for a long time. They talk a lot about data harms, but understand that that overlaps with many kinds of social harms. So I would love to be thinking about how we can build knowledge across this ecosystem, across maybe other ecosystems as well, with communities that involve building places to ask questions like, as the people inhabiting our systems, what do you need to protect? And from whom do you need to protect it? And what vectors do those people use? Like, we don't actually have to make guesses about this. People know, they have lived experience with this. How bad are the consequences if those things aren't protected? What actually happens to you in your life? And this is changing. The way that social data is being weaponized is changing from week to week right now in the US. So I think this would be an excellent moment to dig into this kind of work. And then, what are the elements of the things that we're making that make it harder for you to protect what you need to protect, and what can we do to help? I was reading a great paper that I'll link to about building social threat modeling into early, like, introductory CS courses for people who are starting to think about system architecture. And one of the things that came out of that paper working with undergraduates was that it would be useful to actually maybe move it from a strictly negative practice and into something more like collaborative risk-benefit analysis. So working with people from various different communities about, what are the trade-offs? How you would characterize the risks posed by the kinds of design choices we're making, how we can reduce that risk or boost your benefit, and like what's helping, what's working. There's a fantastic report that came out, I think, end of last year from a group called the Engine Room that's London-based. And they went around and spoke with people in sort of digital rights and activist communities in the global South about what their experiences were with new networks. And they came in, I think, wanting to understand, like, how can we get these people into, I think at the time, mostly the Fediverse, because Blue Sky was really just emerging at that point. But the responses they got back were so sophisticated in a sense of trade-offs and the risk-benefit balances that they actually wound up writing a very different kind of report, which was, what are the understandings of these people in authoritarian and oppressive regimes who are making calls about which networks to use because their people are in different places, because their data is being weaponized in different ways. There's a lot of actually quite sophisticated knowledge about this stuff just floating around if you go out and get it. But to do this work, I think we do have to acknowledge that, we got to talk about who's vulnerable. And that involves making value judgments about whose needs get prioritized, which is something that's often, I think, really uncomfortable in a lot of tech spaces. But the reality is, of course, if you're building social tools, you're actually making those kinds of ethical calculations, whether you want to or not. Not making a choice is making a choice. Letting it get handled by business logic is a decision that's going to have real world consequences. Ursula Franklin, who someone Blaine quoted yesterday, she's like one of my favorite technology thinkers. She was a physicist and a peace activist, Quaker, German Canadian Holocaust survivor. And she was someone who thought and spoke about the connection between technology and justice and fear. And she was very sharp about the idea of justifiable fear. And she was very clear about what that meant. For her, that was, people who were worried that they wouldn't be able to feed their children, or of our brothers and sisters who have reasons to fear the knock on the door at night. So I think there are ways to be very clear about real harms, obvious harms, that can allow us to define the kinds of groups we want to, not necessarily build an entire application entirely focused only on those needs, but especially when it comes to both exposure of different kinds of information, design choices, and also just a sense of, like who are we keeping in the conversation? Maybe a year ago, it seemed a little bit over the top to talk about fearing the knock on the door at night, but I think it's a little bit less so right now. And I think if we can dig into that work as a group, maybe that even moves us a little closer toward the design justice community. It's an approach and sort of a network. Sasha Costanza-Chalk's excellent book really pulls together the threads from that work over the last many years. It's an approach to design that's led, Sasha says, by marginalized communities and that aims to challenge rather than reproduce structural inequalities. And again, this is stuff that like emerges from digital rights work, that emerges from kind of an activist mode. But I think it's becoming clearer that there are necessary connections between that world and what we think of as perhaps a more purely technical world. So one of the problems with doing this kind of thinking and digging and communal knowledge building is that it's very hard to do this if you are crunching away at something really highly technical, something that you have to produce very quickly. Maybe you're building a protocol. Like, who's going to do this? Are you going to have a team? Like, you don't even probably have a user research person. Now you're going to build like a threat modeling crew. So I think something that I'm really interested in is what is the shape of an institution or an institutions or a community of practice that could do this kind of work and share it across projects? And that brings me to the second piece I want to talk about, which is useful institutions. And specifically, I want to talk about them as vernacular institutions. Some people in the room, when I say vernacular, may be thinking linguistics. Some of you may be thinking architecture. Some of you may be wondering what this has to do with anything. I'm going to come at it from an architecture point of view, as in vernacular as opposed to monumental. The vernacular is the homegrown. It's what emerges from a locality. In architecture, the vernacular is a traditional Basque farmhouse. Or it is the way you build homes in Greece to deal with the extraordinarily high wind and solar exposure. Or it is my favorite example of this completely badass yurt, which has, all of these new school materials put together in an extremely traditional way, down to the like awesome ram horn stuck in there in the webbing. So this is vernacular in the sense of architecture. What does vernacular mean when we talk about institutions? Some of the kinds of historic institutions that people discuss as vernacular are like the benevolent societies and the aid and pleasure clubs, social aid and pleasure clubs that are in New Orleans that are 200 years old and still running. The free medical clinics in Greece, the people's free medical clinics run by the Black Panthers in the United States, freedom schools, right now, local mutual aid projects, but also indigenous institutions through history and around the world that focus on conflict resolution and the maintenance of justice. So vernacular institutions are emergent and they are highly local. They serve needs on the ground and not the needs of the state. If you can't tell that the specter of James C. Scott is like floating over all of this stuff, it is. They serve not just the needs of, they do not serve the needs of the state, but also they do not serve the needs of whatever layer it is that is substituting for the state. So perhaps the corporate hegemony of the current state of the internet. Vernacular institutions are more useful than they are legible. And this has been brought home to me as particularly double-edged in the last year, especially because in the Fediverse governance research project I work on, the need for vernacular network institutions came up a lot. People didn't necessarily use that exact language, but when we talk to people who are doing the work of thoughtfully governing Fediverse servers, the idea of a collective action problem came up all the time. There was all this stuff that needed to be done that really couldn't be done by individual teams and people running servers. They needed someone else to do that work. And there actually was an institution that came up in almost every single interview, which was IFTAS, Independent Federated Trust and Safety. That was an organization founded to listen to the needs of people running servers and then build out the tooling and capacities that they needed, including, software for handling shared block lists, and also quite recently the Fediverse's first viable CSAM detection and reporting system. And in conversations that we had with server runners, it was really clear that they considered that work essential and foundational, but also just the start of what they needed. So we kept hearing, maybe IFTAS could also do this or handle that. That was a real common thread, which is why it is such a bummer that what has happened between last summer when we finished that research and now is that IFTAS has actually begun the process of shutting down because the organization couldn't secure enough funding to keep going. And I think that's for several reasons. I don't want to get super far down that rabbit hole, but in my conversations with Jas Michael King, who founded IFTAS and still is going to run, whatever it winds up being later, is that IFTAS was not legible to the kinds of organizations that could have provided longer term funding. It was something that ran at a level beyond what simple sort of small dollar crowdfunding could do. The Fediverse is still very tiny. But to keep that network safe and viable, there was a lot of relatively expensive work that needed doing. And the civil society organizations that he spoke with just really couldn't understand the shape of IFTAS. So I think something really crucial for us to be thinking about, and I think a lot of you already are, is that vernacular institutions actually are and are embedded in vernacular economies. This is a term from Ivan Illich's work. My favorite sort of place, my favorite writer who gets into this isn't actually Illich, whose ideas I love, but whose writing I find really annoying and difficult to read. Alistair MacLean's Soil and Soul details vernacular economies that he experienced in the Hebrides and gets into the way that layers of what he calls like a full mutuality and also a layer of reciprocity and sort of a formal barter system work together to create a functioning vernacular economy. I think you see echoes of this in the commons management practices that Eleanor Ostrom gets into, another really fruitful zone. Also, a few months ago, I sort of ran into this relatively obscure work from the 90s that a scholar named Muhammad Abdullah Ibn Salah did on the entangled social and built worlds of this traditional settlement in Saudi Arabia, in a settlement called Al-Khalaf. And this is just a tiny thing way, way down in, the kind of stuff that I really love the most and get stuck in. But I want to bring it to you because I think it's the kind of example that maybe enlivens our thinking here. He wrote about a tool-making institution in this traditional, very agricultural community. And the institution was called Al-Rusameh. It's a social convention, he wrote, that regulated the work between farmers and skilled laborers, so carpenters and ironsmiths, leather makers, people who made the tools essential to make the agricultural economy work. And when farmers needed tools, they would pay in full for their new tool or piece of equipment. But Al-Rusameh paid for its maintenance forever. And as a result, the community shared about 1% of the value of their total agricultural project product with this tool making community. And that was understood as the way that you keep this group viable. You allow them to maintain their workshops. And then when your stuff breaks, you bring it to them and they fix it forever. This is one of, tens of thousands of these kinds of institutions through human history. And I feel like we have a very impoverished zone right now of economic exchange. I mean, God bless micropayments, right? But come on, we actually have an entire human history of vernacular institutions and economies, of communities that have found ways to make this stuff work in genuinely sustainable ways. So it turns out I do actually get to talk a little bit about this painting today, in that this is a painting that represents a very ancient set of practices. It's the way that you maintain the kind of wood harvest that you need to be able to do your agricultural and building and various other kinds of work over time without actually losing all of your forests. And it's embedded in these traditional community practices. There's also people eating like festival waffles and a whole thing going on there, but we won't get into that. The thing I love about this painting is that that's the work in the foreground, right? But if you look back and see what's happening behind it, there's actually such an intense storm out at sea that it's breaking the ships. And in the back, you have this monumental fortress that's being encroached on by a glacier. So there's a lot of really heavy shit happening in this painting. But what we get to focus on is this steady work of, basic human vernacular economy and institution that preserves human life, even as all of these, bigger enterprises are coming to ruin. So maybe it's clear why I find some comfort in that idea right now. I want to land this on some thought from one of my favorite sort of cantankerous thinkers from the movement world, David Graeber, who wrote that the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it is something that we make and could just as easily make differently. I think a lot of the story of the last 15, 20, 25 years has been about the conflict between, on one hand, in technology. The idea that the right way to make things with our new technologies on the internet, on the social internet, is to be at least sort of blandly decent, to recognize a minimum responsibility for what happens to people who use our products, and bow to some social norms about not hosting and accelerating violent hate speech or becoming the infrastructure from which genocides are launched. And on the other hand, the idea that actually the whole point of having the internet and these new networks and capital is the freedom to throw all the norms and quotidian decencies that might let us coexist into the garbage, and instead do whatever results in the biggest individual advantage. And I think it's fairly clear which of these philosophies is ascendant in a good chunk of tech right now, when we're in this incredibly gonzo moment when both the president of the United States and like the billionaire shadow daddy both own their own personal social networks, and are in extremely tightly with these massive hegemonic tech companies that control so much public discourse and surveillance surfaces. But what I see here and in many other parts of the movement toward open protocols and non-centralized networks is the crucial and frankly subversive liberty, the sense that the liberty of our work is not actually an adolescent freedom from caring what we do to other people, but the freedom to actually care as much as we fucking want to about the effects of our work in the world. Or thank you. I have notes and citations coming at this address. It's not up right now because after Ted and I set up the Zoom first thing this morning, I couldn't use my machine to push it to the repo, but that'll be up very soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. We're going to do questions a little bit differently today. We're still going to form a line up front, and we'll make sure that both Erin can hear us and the folks on the stream can hear us. So if we've got questions, please come on up. Erin, can you see me if I stand right here?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Can you see me if we stand right here?
I can see you. You're good. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Questions for Erin. All right. Wait for John to come on up.
Great talk. On the social, on the social threat modeling side, looking at things like North Sky and Black Sky, you can see some of these things are starting to happen of their own accord in the atmosphere. What are the things at the institutional level, or whether it's formal institutions or informal things, what could help goose that process along, if you will?
I mean, I'll say I think Black Sky is like the emblematic vernacular institution for our moment right now. What can goose it along? I mean, I think to me, just getting these ideas into the conversation, talking about the fact that like there's this whole layer of sort of social protocol that we could actually be working on together alongside the technical protocol that at Proto was actually, clearly built to run alongside this kind of social conversation. So I don't know what can goose it besides a certain amount of like maybe some shock and terror about the state of things, but more joyfully, I think honestly getting people together in places like this and talking about like what are the things we can be working on together on the social and cultural side alongside the tech. Seems like a good start to me. So thanks, Boris and Ted.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you?
Yeah. Hi, Erin. Great talk. So kind of following up on that, because my question, I am a current CS student. Where do you see strategic threat modeling fitting in best into curriculums, and how would they kind of go out to things like the tech boot camps and the smaller programs out there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll make sure that when I post the notes and sites, I link to, I think it's like a 23 paper about some experiments it was like, how do we stop talking about things that make the students' eyes glaze over, like ethical computing, which I think we're certainly in a moment where that's like being pushed aside, and get into something that's like more tactical, more like that we can get our hands around. I think building something like social threat modeling, whether it's collaborative or not, into those conversations as maybe a more practical way into thinking about like ethics in tech. Would be really interesting. And something that I really liked about this specific paper is that they were talking about it at the systems architecture level. So it wasn't like a UX project. It was like when we're doing the architectural work, how do we build that stuff in? So I think that's a great start. It would be amazing if boot camps could be thinking about this. And I honestly, like, given my own experience doing, user research and UX work alongside so many different kinds of tech projects, I think the more practical, like, the closer to the ground this work is, the faster students will actually begin using it and putting it to work, getting it out of sort of the realm of philosophy or something that we should aspire to into something like you can get 5 people around a table and bust this out in an afternoon, just like buy the pizza. I'm a pragmatist, so I think just getting into it and starting it, trying it, and publishing the results would be amazing.
Yep. Hi, Erin. Really appreciate your talk, Jazz from the Blue Sky team. So I have a question. I mostly work on infrastructure, but whenever we do feature work, there's a lot of internal conversation and internal red teaming of how is the feature that we're going to build going to be used to hurt people and abuse, and how do we,
of course,
like, how do we design features in such a way that we minimize the potential harms and maximize the potential goods of features? And it feels like every time you build a feature, you're always dissatisfied with the end result that you get to, because there is no way to build something that cannot be used to do harm. because then you would build nothing at all. So I guess how do you navigate that in a way and like come to satisfying conclusions that help you be happy with what you ship and with what you're building?
Yeah. God, thank you for asking such a well-formed question. Something that I've been so impressed with, coming out of just from the beginning of the things that Jay was talking about initially, but also just the way Blue Sky has rolled things out. It's so clear that y'all are being so incredibly thoughtful. Being thoughtful doesn't mean you'll get it right, obviously, and like what's right is going to change through time also. And I'm glad that you mentioned, like, I think there's specifically the danger of paralysis, right? Like, I'll tell you, after I did the research on like what happened in Myanmar and like what Meta did, I was like, maybe we should just fucking stop all of this internet shit and just like roll it back. I don't know, like, who among us is actually really qualified to make these kinds of calls? But then I talked more with the people who were actually doing the work in Myanmar, and they were like, the people doing the digital rights work, the sort of Burmese organizations that sprang up to do this stuff were like, no, we really, really need the technology. What we need is for people to hear us. We're here. We're collecting the knowledge. We can bring it into companies and explain what's going on. And they did that with Meta. Meta just chose to not understand it, not to not hear it. I think especially as Blue Sky and AppProto is not just dealing with problems in the US, the fact that there are all of these civic society organizations globally who actually possess a huge amount of knowledge about this stuff is someplace that I would want to be, digging into. Someone like Victoire Rio, who started a new organization in Europe to try to make some of this information more legible, is someone to talk to. But like, it's always going to be a balance, right? It's always going to be, if you're going to make things, if you're going to do the experiments, you're going to get some of them wrong. But having connections to at least representatives of communities that are experiencing the most harm so that you don't have to just game it out by yourselves. I think whenever it's especially scary to me making decisions sort of alone in a room with other people who are like us, right? So connections into those groups who can bring in things that we would not necessarily have thought of seems really crucial to me. But yeah, like I appreciate so much the work that you all have been doing to try to make things as safe as possible, while moving also extremely quickly. So yeah, it's hard. Thank you.
So I had a couple questions. One was kind of, you touched on, Jazz kind of talked to it a bit, and then you brought it up in your response, which is the ever-evolving part of safety and how one group that may have been marginalized at one point then becomes the oppressor later on, and how to build into your systems the ability to find that and kind of reflect. It just seems like, especially when you're dealing with code, like it's very easy for what once worked to then get gamed out.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually borrowing from just InfoSec world, things are always changing on that side, right? It's not like the kinds of threats that you experience in an InfoSec way are going to be static. That's the whole game. It's always an arms race. It's always changing. And the players change. Sometimes it's nation states, sometimes it's, sort of scam hives, sometimes it's both. I think taking that kind of posture toward cultural threats is also really useful, and just maintaining like low center of gravity and understanding that these things, the cultural landscape is going to shift just as much as the like things we think of as security problems, as network abuse, as all of that stuff. I think that's a useful and sort of pragmatic way to ground that work. It's a hard question, right? And things are changing all the time. And like, I am very aware of like what's changing in the US and Canada, but like things move very fast in all kinds of places, in ways that actually do play into the network world. So yeah, I like the posture of taking this as like ultimately a security question, but sort of on the cultural side, and just assuming that like you've got to be out there doing the listening and detection work, or you're gonna get overwhelmed by something you didn't see coming.
And then the other question was, you brought up a really interesting example with out of Saudi Arabia, the economic model of basically the capital expense and then kind of a maintenance payment that was used to sustain the production chain during times when there wasn't that capital income. And it seems like right now in our economy, we've kind of built that maintenance cost into the capital expense. And I'm just wondering, are there any good models that you've seen in the Western world of how to kind of break that kind of preempting the, like, we made a thing, now we have to live on it for the next 20 years while we sustain it. And like, yeah, I'm just wondering how to kind of, if you've seen any good models in the Western world.
I mean, I think there's actually a ton of stuff happening at the, I mean, thank you for the question. Those were great questions. At the community levels, I think that this is also just a question that we're all confronting really hard. I mean, there's no conversation about this stuff that doesn't deal with economics, right? There's no question about this stuff offline in like the mutual aid world that doesn't involve like how do we sustain these efforts to keep each other alive, right? If we lose things like the governmental capacity to handle certain kinds of things, what are we going to do to come up with something that can be sustained at the more local level? So I would myself say like this is something that I'm still digging into. I don't know that I have like an obvious modern model. I actually think looking at the economic model that the Black Panthers used is a really good start. They were doing some incredibly sophisticated stuff all over the U.S., and that was not actually very long ago to get free clinics and free schools and all of those things up and continue to run. But I think that this is one of the big open questions, right? Sorry, I know we're getting over on time, Ted. How are we?
No, we're totally good. We've got more.
Okay. I tried to talk fast.
I'll try to. Hi, thanks for the great talk, and I appreciate all the references. I'm curious in your research and what you've seen in like organizations and companies when they do fail to protect those who are like most vulnerable and those who are harmed. I know the Meta example is like very much an extreme case, but like across the board, what have you seen that causes them to fail to do that? Like, is it a refusal to care or like this recklessness, or is it just like systematically, organizationally? And then like how can we preempt those failures, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, God, it happens at so many levels, right? I think honestly, like so much of it, like the meta stuff is really extreme. I think it is very, very common that it's just a question of we are moving really fast and trying to do like the right thing while continuing to move forward as fast as we can, and we miss things, right? And what it is that falls into the sort of acceptable externalities depends on who's in the room. So I think that is like where I would go to for that is like getting people into those rooms who have varied experience, who have connections into communities that have varied experience is the critical thing, especially for teams and projects that are trying to move quickly and that don't have access to like massive monumental institutional research programs, which is almost everyone. But I do think that like the meta thing is a useful example of like how you build a massive global corporation that is very concerned with pushing useful knowledge away from its core. That's certainly a corrective, a thing to build away from. But again, like I do think it tends to be more a question of just like missing things or just prioritizing them down because maybe we thought that it didn't matter as much, that maybe what we did online didn't have as much of a direct effect on what happens offline. But I think the experience of the last couple of decades and certainly years should have proved that wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Amazing. Legibility has been coming up a lot for me in so many different ways. And I feel like we're collectively feeling our way through to the types of vernacular institutions, thank you for the phrasing, that we need. And it feels very hard because a lot of these things feel like first time, and where do we get this information? So I'm leaning into things like Coase's theory of the firm, and I'm like, oh, we're in the network era, and there's interesting things happening. Over the next 12 months, and I'm saying that because you already said, bummed I couldn't be there, do it again next year, so there's some pressure there, right? Can you maybe talk about some emerging legibility you see, or some thoughts about how we hint to others that might want to join us, what sort of signals we send?
Yeah, I mean, I think I should say out loud that illegibility cuts both ways, right? It's actually also extremely protective. And I think the usefulness of vernacular institutions and vernacular economies is that they can stay below the radar, or even if not below the radar, like just hard to pin down. And I think AtProto is, this is an ecosystem that was made to be hard to pin down, right? Like that was the original promise of the internet. So I do think that leaning into institutions that are hard to pin down, models of organizing ourselves that can't be easily decapitated, like there's something really important there. In terms of like how you gain the positive benefits of legibility while staying like appropriately illegible, like that's hard. I do think that there are people with connections to what I think of as like more monumental funding models who are getting pretty curious about this stuff. You see that here. Thanks, we saw, Peter yesterday had some great things to say about that. I think, man, how do you get people? I mean, can you do more of these? That's one piece. No, but I think continuing to demonstrate that there's like a real thing here. There's gonna be a gap, right? And what you I think want to do is get as far along as you can before you fall into the danger of full capture, right? So I don't know the answer to that, but I do think the idea of like trying to maintain that liberty, trying to maintain the right level of illegibility, and trying to be hard to pin down and decapitate, while also finding the representatives from some sort of more monumental structures who can do things like provide stabilizing funding, like that is the real challenge, right? And sometimes you're going to get captured and eaten, and that's how it goes. Like there's no way to always avoid that, but that's why maybe a multiplicity of institutions becomes so extremely important. That was not a real answer, but that was the best one I had.
That was amazing, thank you. We are all geese.
Yes.
Thank you for your talk. That was really good, and it's something that we're thinking about. I know there's a lot of people in this room who are building. I know that I'm building, and there's a lot of people in this room who are thinking about building. So I think this is kind of a unique opportunity to ask you, do you have anything on your wish list, like physical things that you feel like should get built? Maybe specific app views or web views or features that you want to see in the things that people are building right now.
Oh man. I do not myself have that list. I think that would be a good thing to have. I'm really excited about so many things that so many people are working on right now, that I didn't come with like a wish list. and maybe this is partly just my orientation, like I'm all about sort of process over solutions, right? So how you're making things is, I think, the thing that I am most excited about. I also love the things that are being made. But like Ms. Belba's talk yesterday was such a great way to end the day, thinking about like how you do this stuff, how you bring the knowledge into communities. I think the orientation is like the most critical thing for me. What actually gets made is going to come out of the needs of these various communities and you know, in the interest of developers, which is extraordinarily powerful thing. Like developer motivation is like a nuclear force, right? Like that's great. So to me, it's sort of a question of just like making sure that the orientation is tied into these like cultural concerns. If it's a bummer to always think about it as threat modeling, maybe it is that like risk benefit thing. But yeah, that's a total non-answer. But I'm excited about everything that's getting made, so I don't have favorites. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Erin, for these amazing, like the vernacular organizations thing. Like, actually, legitimately blew my mind when you first said it. So I'm like, it gives us modes of being able to talk about what we're building, the sorts of things that we want to see in the world, and also how we interact with existing structures, which I think is super important for us to figure out, and as we are trying to make change. So thank you very much for all these amazing thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you for the questions, and thank you for all those amazing answers. And yes, next year, I guess.
Yes. Thank you.